Good afternoon, folks. East Coast time. Good morning, folks. West Coast time. And good evening, good nightish time, folks in India who may be watching because we do have audiences in India also. Thank you for logging in, joining in this live show or a webinar hosted by the US India Political Action Committee and the Imagine India Institute on Saturday noons. My name is Robin Sachdev, and I'll be the host moderator of the program today. We often pick up topics of interest, of course, to the Indian American community, domestic politics within the United States, public affairs issues of interest within the US, and also, of course, often on topics of US India relations. Today, the topic is actually much more focused, and we are going to dig deep into aspects of domestic American politics. What are the nuances and vectors shaping the politics of America, and especially the politics of the Democratic Party? We are honored to have a wonderful guest with us, with whom we'll have a deep discussion to delve into the topic of the day today that we have. The topic is about the Democratic Party, what is the future direction of the party? And as you know, with any political party, there, of course, I mean, no party is a monolith, right? Parties have vectors and forces which kind of interplay to create the outcomes of that political movement. Now, in America, the progressive left has been making news and has been making progress, so to say, right? And especially led by some individuals who've come up over the past few years, especially, let's say, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, with her and the phenomenon of her politics, the question of the day today is that is it shaping up to be a movement wherein the AOC-led groupings are challenging the mainstream or the traditional or the orthodox Democratic Party as we've come to understand it? To discuss on that, it is my pleasure to welcome to the studio with me Dr. Leo Casey, the Executive Director of the Albert Shanker Institute. Welcome, Dr. Casey.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
So I think an important place to start here is an understanding about the ways in which American politics are exceptional. It is the case that the United States doesn't have a mass labor or socialist party. And that makes it truly exceptional across the global north and most of the global south. Political scientists who've looked at this have pointed to various sorts of factors. Some of it has to do with the way the electoral system and the system of government is set up, which makes it very difficult for a third party to develop. Some of it has to do with the history of racism going back to slavery and the genocide of indigenous people. Some of it has to do with immigration and the fact that the American working class has been an immigrant working class drawn from all different parts of the world. And so there's always been differences of religion and culture and language. But the net effect of all of that is that the American political spectrum looks different than other countries in the global north and in most of the global south. And so when you look at the United States, our spectrum would look somewhat similar to a center to right spectrum in Europe or in Canada. And the Democratic Party would be, generally speaking, a very broad center party, its politics in most other settings. There have been socialists elected to the United States Congress before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and now 3 other colleagues, but they've been very small in number. And around the turn of the 20th century, there were 2. In the 1980s, there were 2. There have been others who have been socialist in all but name. But it is exceptional, I think, at this point in the history of the United States to see the emergence of a explicitly democratic socialist grouping within the Congress. And that poses some interesting questions. So Ocasio-Cortez has said that in another country, she wouldn't be in the Democratic Party. And it's true that, if you look just to the north of us, to Canada, for example, Ocasio-Cortez would be in the New Democratic Party, which is the Social Democratic Party of Canada. And Joe Biden and most of the Democrats would probably be in the Liberal Party, which is the centrist party, the main centrist party in Canada. And so it is important, I think, to have that sort of context to understand her emergence and the emergence of what is now not just an explicitly democratic socialist group within Congress, but also a broader progressive grouping. That there are other Congress people like Ro Khanna and Jamilia Payapal who are definitely to the left of what had traditionally been the Democratic mainstream, and also in a place like Canada would be part of the New Democratic Party. It's also important to understand, I think, that the Democratic Party itself has been moving to the left. American politics have been marked by what political scientists call an asymmetrical polarization. What that means is that, traditionally, both the Democratic and Republican parties were somewhat heterogeneous. They both had, throughout most of the 20th century, they both had conservative and liberal wings, one to the right and one to the left. And what happened after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and 70s was that there began a process of consolidation where the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, a lot of which had been based in the South of the United States, began to disappear. And the liberal wing of the Republican Party, most of which had been based in the Northeast and other parts of the North, began to disappear. And so you have consolidated parties of the left and right. And then with the election of Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party takes a serious turn to the right. And what you see in the 2016 election with the election of Donald Trump is the consolidation of really a far right perspective within the Republican Party, one which is explicitly racist and xenophobic. There's always been a sort of what we call in American politics dog whistle, where Republicans would sort of alluded to sort of racial issues, but not been explicitly racist over the last 40 years. But Trump breaks that pattern and takes on an explicitly racist and xenophobic cast. And what happens in reaction to that is the Democratic Party moves to the left. Now, there's nothing in the Democratic Party which is really analogous to Trump and Trumpism. There's not an authoritarian wing of the Democratic Party. There's not a Democratic, wing of the Democratic Party that is appealing to things like racism and other sorts of, quote unquote, wedge issues. But there is definitely a more social democratic cast to the Democratic Party, and Ocasio-Cortez represents that trend. Now, the United States, given the nature of that polarization, and given what we call gerrymandering, which is electoral districts are drawn by state governments, and in many cases, they're drawn to maximize the vote of the incumbent party. So across the United States now, there are states where Republicans are overrepresented and represented in districts where there's not a serious chance of defeating them. Given that reality. What you find is that the Republican Party can take on this Trumpist cast. The problem for the Democratic Party is those remaining what we would call swing districts, those districts which are competitive, where both the Democrat and the Republican Party has a serious chance of winning. So Ocasio-Cortez and her colleagues in this progressive wing come from what we would call deep Democratic districts. When she, in her last election, in the general election, she won overwhelmingly against the Republican candidate. There's not a real serious chance that she could be defeated. And it's also true of the other Democratic socialists and progressives who are now in Congress. But she also understands that in order to enact any of the legislative agenda that she's interested in, she needs Democratic majorities in the House and in the Senate. And she needs to have a Democratic presidency because it will do no good if there is a growing progressive caucus in Congress, but they are in the legislative minority. And so there's a sort of challenging political situation for her, where on the one hand, she wants to build a stronger progressive caucus within the Democratic Party. But on the other hand, she recognizes that the only way to move the legislative agenda around things like the Green New Deal, with her proposal for dealing with climate change, around things like a $15 minimum wage, around things like developing a robust public system of healthcare. If she's going to move the agenda on those issues, then it's only going to be in the context of an overall Democratic majority, and so that's a somewhat delicate task. And there was a sort of minor misstep which she did recently, where she raises an extraordinary amount of money because she has a profile greater than any other member of the House of Representatives, except perhaps the Speaker. And she has a rather dedicated following, particularly among young people. And so she, wanting to ensure that the Democrats would be in the majority in Congress, she sent some of the money she raised to Democrats that were fighting in swing districts. But it is in those swing districts where there is also a lot of opposition to her. And so I think, the Congress people in those swing districts, the Democratic Congress people, may appreciate, that you wanted to send them money, but I'm sure they all returned it because it would be used against them by their Republican opponents. So there is this sort of delicate dance that she has to perform to both, on the one hand, build a strong presence within the Democratic Party for progressive politics, moving it to the left, and at the same time ensuring that the Democrats are in the majority.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Casey, for your opening comments. I think almost the entire of the various topics that we are looking to discuss. Folks, this is going to be live on the US National Committee page, as well as Alexandria Institute page. Please put in your questions. This is a live discussion, and take advantage of the minute guest we have today. There's a guest somewhere. Is it? So please put in your questions and comments, and we'll be more than delighted to take it. Now, Dr. Casey, as you were mentioning, I think the key point that you mentioned about American politics and the uniqueness in the way it's a two-party system, right? and the idea of the interlocking cleavages, so that between both the sides, both parties will be forced to come to some kind of center within this for the political scenario of the country. So that, like, okay, you just have two big tents. Either one tent is the conservative Republican tent, the other tent is the Democrat tent. And within the tent, whatever be the interest groups, philosophies, ideologies, have to battle it out. And exactly as you were articulating, the challenges or the aspirations of whichsoever leader to shape the party in their own vision or anything that they would like to do. So those are the challenges. It has definitely a lot of advantages because, in a sense, it brings the party together towards a more moderate strength. However, perhaps, and that's a question I would have of you, like in the case of the conservatives or the Trump presidency or the Trump years, it seems that the Tea Party, quote unquote, which would have played a similar role within the Republican side, it ended up kind of getting, so much traction that it pulled the party towards its own end rather than the reverse, which had happened. That the Tea Party could have influenced the mainstream Republican or conservative ideology, philosophy, or politics, and some of their agenda taken up. But apparently, the reverse has happened. The Tea Party perspective actually completely taken the Republican Party. So, in a sense, do you see a similar possibility in the Democratic Party? That, let's say, what Ocasio-Cortez, I know it's a big, and I mean, maybe it's not a possibility as such, but do you see the progressives and colleagues with Ocasio-Cortez could build up that much momentum that they could take away the Democratic Party from where the party is right now towards their, I would not say extreme, but a more tilt towards their agenda? Would they be able to gather such horsepower, do you think, sir?
So I think what is happening already is that the progressives have more weight within the Democratic Party. I think that the proposals that Biden has made in the first 100 days of office, both the rescue plan around economic stimulus and around providing the resources that are necessary to fight the COVID pandemic, and now what he's calling his infrastructure plan. Both of those are well to the left of what Democrats have offered over the last 40 years. They really hearken back to the kind of political ideology and economic program of the New Deal and Great Society. And so I think it's important to see that and not look exclusively, which I think what people do, who's the president, what sort of wing of the party do they come from. What happened in the case of the Republican Party was that for a long time, there was a split between the Republican elites, which were basically interested in a Republican economic agenda, what academics would call a neoliberal agenda, one that was based on austerity with regard to government programs, on privatization, on deregulation. But they would use wedge issues, such as race or such as abortion, to attract the base of the party. And what Trump did was he came in and he took those wedge issues and raised them to a new, rather extreme level and captured the party. So I don't think there's any question now that the Republican Party, including the Congressional Party, is a party of Trump. That there is extreme unwillingness to face down Trump. What is extraordinary is that so few Republican senators were prepared to impeach him, even after he was out of office and had incited what was a violent insurrection against the nation's capital, just an unprecedented act in the history of American democracy. So, but I don't think it necessarily follows that the Democratic Party should be seen analogously. I do think, what we can expect is that the progressive forces within the Democratic Party will grow, that they will win more congressional seats, they will win more Senate seats, that the political center of gravity in the Democratic Party will move to the left. I just yesterday, the Biden administration had suggested that maybe they would keep the levels that the United States was accepting refugees from other countries at the Trump levels. And there was a sort of instantaneous reaction from across the spectrum of the Democratic Party that said, that's not acceptable. And they quickly reversed. So I think, what you will see, and I think it is not so much important, does AOC run for senator? Does a candidate of the left become the next presidential candidate? Somebody like an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders? I think both of them are now old enough that they're unlikely to be that person themselves, but there are certainly others who could pick up that banner. I think that is, it's perhaps not so much important to focus on those individuals as it is to see the sort of broad changes within the Democratic Party.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey. Yes, absolutely. Folks, if you're watching by, please come by, wave by, check by, put in your comment, put in your questions that you may have. It's a very, very interesting discussion I think we are having. It's nothing about, the day-to-day battles that we are in, but this is a discussion about the future trends and alignment or realignment of American politics, as Dr. Leo Casey is sharing with us, the executive director of the Albert Shanker Institute, as to where the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is going. What is what are the issues and what are the forces maybe or aspirations driving a certain wing or certain folks who have a certain belief in certain policies and programs within the Democratic Party. And yes, Dr. Casey, as you mentioned about this refugee issue, which came up just yesterday, right? Which apparently was seen as the Biden administration or President Biden kind of, being ambivalent and sticking to the previous numbers of the Trump administration, but saying that they will relax some of the conditions, but the total number would remain the same, which was at variance or actually in opposition to his stated campaign promises that he would raise the numbers, I think, to about 60,000, if I'm not mistaken, that was the number. So what this shows is that the wing or the voices or the articulation is having an impact, or is at least out there within the party and holding it up to its own, promises. Now, that being said, and as you've been talking, I think if I can capture what you're saying in a sense, there was a question which I was going to ask you, but I think you've already kind of gone deep into it. Is American politics heading into a realignment of sorts? And I know this term kind of comes up off and on, right? But do you see it really as a realignment, a deep realignment going on in American politics?
So there's two ways in which we could talk about a realignment. One way is when groups of voters move from supporting one party to another party. So, for example, in the 1930s and 40s, when the New Deal was established, there were some important shifts in terms of its electoral support. African Americans, which had been largely supportive of the Republican Party, going back to the fact that it was the Republican Party that had ended slavery after the Civil War, they shift to support for the Democratic Party. And by the 1960s, the African Americans are probably the most loyal group to the Democratic Party simply in terms of the numbers of people who voted for them. So there's a question about are we looking at possible shifts in that direction? One possible shift is around education. It is the case that educated suburban voters, particularly women, have moved in significant ways from being more supportive of Republican candidates when Republican candidates were moderates to the Democratic Party. And so if you look at the last couple elections, what you begin to see is a significant movement to the Democrats in terms of that educated vote. That's a significant move. The other way in which you can talk about realignments is the parties themselves. So going back to the 1960s, there was a theory among democratic socialists at that time that the way to develop a mass political party of the left in the United States was to realign the Democrats. That would be to basically force out of the Democratic Party the Southern Democrats, which were quite conservative, which were supporting Jim Crow segregation, and that would make the Democratic Party into a true party of the left, as opposed to the sort of heterogeneous party that had existed before that. And I think that realignment did occur. It occurred as a result of the civil rights movement. And so you see figures like Strom Thurmond, who began his career as a Southern Democrat, arch segregationist, very conservative, and moved to the Republican Party. He's sort of emblematic of a move that happened that way. And so, beginning particularly with the Reagan years, you see white conservative Southerners moving from the Democratic Party to the Republicans. A corresponding realignment happens around the Republican Party, where sort of moderate and liberal Republicans, there was a time, for example, where in New York, some of the most liberal, some of the most left elected officials, like Fiorello LaGuardia, who was mayor of New York, were Republicans. There's, complicated reasons why that's the case, but it was the reality. And they're basically literally no longer any liberal Republicans and very, very few moderate Republicans left in the Republican Party. So I think that realignment has already been accomplished. What is interesting now is in the context of this political polarization, is the Democratic Party returning to more of a New Deal politics, which would break with the last 40 years of Democratic policy ever since the Carter administration, and taking up once again a more social democratic vision. I wouldn't necessarily call it democratic socialist in the vein of Ocasio-Cortez and her colleagues, but certainly a more social democratic program. And I think that is underway. The issues that having a broad social democratic party around issues of the economy and around issues like healthcare and education and so on is really not very controversial in the context of American politics. You can get broad support that would even include parts of the Republican base for that. The issues that are really divisive, what we call the wedge issues now, are more along the lines of what are called cultural issues. And so immigration would be one such issue. Questions of reproductive freedom for women and whether there are full abortion rights would be another issue. Right now, for a long time, rights for lesbian and gay people was one of those issues. And over the last 20, 25 years, there's been a significant move to support LGBTQ rights. But Republicans are attempting to make a wedge issue out of transgender rights. And so, there is sort of, I probably will betray my view of this, but there is sort of absurd focus on like whether or not transgender high school kids should be able to participate in intramural athletics, which is really a sort of moral panic created around the kids that has like absolutely no basis in any real concerns. So I do think that it has been the case that what Biden was able to do around the stimulus and around COVID, his proposals around infrastructure, all of those are very, very popular. Surprisingly so, given the polarization of American politics, picking up significant amounts of Republican support. But one of the reasons why there was this misstep around immigration was that remains more of a polarized issue than other. It really breaks down increasingly along the lines of people's political affiliations. One of the effects of the Trump years was that if Trump took a position, Republicans would pick up that position in much greater numbers, and Democrats would react to it negatively in much greater numbers. So, support for immigration among Democrats is very, very strong, but you will find a different set of political positions among Republicans.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey. I mean, you've given us, I think, a very fantastic tour of American political history, as well as, of course, bringing up to the current scenarios. Quite a few things that you mentioned sparked some thoughts in my mind, which I'll come to in a minute or a bit later. But meanwhile, folks, there's a live webinar going on. Please feel free to put in your question or comments, and we'll be happy to take your questions and comments with Dr. Casey out here regarding the trends in the Democratic Party and the challenges to the establishment in some ways with the emergence of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and what she represents in some way. So therefore, my question to you, Dr. Casey, is that it seems that New York has been a good, incubator of such progressives, for example, right? Quite a few. I think, of course, AOC herself is there, then Jamal is there. And then now there's talk of, another candidate, Rana Abdul Hamid, running against Congresswoman Maloney. Now, my question is that when, such forces or within the party, of course, inner party democracy and the primaries, when they're going and supposing some of these candidates or more of such candidates win, would it reduce their overall chances of the Democrat Party? I think you referred to it earlier also, right? Of winning against Republican or conservative candidates. So is there a kind of a division coming within the Democratic Party? Are we seeing some hard stances coming up? So it's pretty fine to say, on the face of it, okay, we all belong to one party, let's say, within the Democratic trend, right? So all folks would have the same agenda. But within the party, of course, there are also political aspirations and their differences and their challenges and their issues of personal interest, personal egos, and chemistry, etc. All there. So, given that, is the rise of AOC kind of accentuating some differences within the Democratic Party, or how are we looking at it?
So I think what's important perhaps for viewers to understand is that in the United States, virtually anybody can run in a primary election. So Bernie Sanders, who to this day is not a formal member of the Democratic Party, he's been elected as an independent. He's never taken out a Democratic Party card, if you want. Was able to run within the Democratic Party primaries in both 2016 and 2020. And so there is, for that reason, a sense in which the politics of a party is very much determined by who wins those primaries. And unlike other countries where I think there is more of a sort of ideological coherence to a party, you don't get to be a candidate for the Labour Party in the UK without some basic sort of a loyalty to the Labour Party and some political ideological commitment to the Labour worldview. So, and the second thing to understand about the primaries is that because the political polarization is reflected very much in this gerrymandering, there are many districts around the country where the primaries are the real election. So like, for example, in New York City now, there's a contest for the mayoral race, which will happen in November. And everybody understands that in New York City, if you win the Democratic primary, it's almost an automatic election in the November election. So all of the focus is on that Democratic Party and who will win it. And so I will expect that inside the Democratic parties, particularly where there are Democrats who are more conservative, like Henry Cuellar in Texas, Democrats who have taken conservative positions on questions like immigration, on questions like women's reproductive freedom, on LGBTQ rights, Democrats who may not be very supportive of unions and the need to really address the problems in American labor law that make it so difficult for workers to organize unions. I would expect that they will face challenges. I'm sure that more moderate Democrats may put up some challenges against Ocasio-Cortez and others on the progressive side. But what I've seen certainly in the last round, there were two sort of democratic socialists who were elected in 2018, Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib out of Detroit, and both of them handily won their primaries. But there will be some contests, and it will be interesting to see how they proceed. It is, I think Democrats will look to whether or not an incumbent in a heavily Democratic office, Democratic voters will look to see how vigorous a political presence they are, how much leadership they're offering. Are they, because anyone who's elected, for example, from the east side of Manhattan, will vote the right way on virtually every question that comes before them. The Democrats people look to see, is this a person that is really leading on the issues
Sure.
that are important to me.
Thank you, Dr. Casey. I had a question. I mean, you mentioned earlier also that, Ocasio-Cortez, she has got a good, formidable fundraising machine ongoing on her own, and as a brand, as a well-known, individual, she has that capability to carry a lot of fundraising. And also, of course, you refer to the misstep wherein, I think her campaign sent to about 32 of the Democrat candidates, 31 or 32, I think, wire transfers of $5,000 each for the campaign finance. And I mean, there, of course, there's some questions. Some folks are maybe keeping or wanting to keep or wanting to, return the money because they feel that they will get more associated and hence more vulnerable to attack by their, opponents in the Republican Party. Now, within that overall context, and as is said often, that money is the mother's milk of politics, So, if she is having this, momentum she's gathering, then where do you see, like, I mean, and of course, we are looking at the cycle of the year 22 and then the year 24. I think that's at least the trend some of us, all of us are looking at. So do you see that her becoming a formidable force also on account of her fundraising abilities?
I think that definitely will happen. What our viewers may not all understand is that money plays a particularly important role in American politics because the Supreme Court basically have allowed, unlike other countries where there are limits on donations and in some cases they're completely public financing of elections. Supreme Court has allowed basically unlimited monetary contributions in American elections, and has also allowed what we call dark money, which is where people can contribute to a campaign without having it publicly known that they are making those contributions. So money in American politics is particularly important. And for a long time, the generally accepted wisdom was that this meant that both the Democratic and Republican parties needed to be friendly to corporations and to the wealthy because they were the ones who were going to finance your campaign. And so there was the view that this, in part, was the reason why the Democrats had moved away somewhat from the New Deal legacy. But what the Bernie Sanders campaign showed, and what Ocasio-Cortez has shown, is that it is possible to raise substantial amounts of money, enough to make you completely competitive, through small amounts from ordinary donors. And so that, I think, has changed the political landscape in some significant ways, because people no longer feel like they have to give deference to corporations in order to be able to finance their campaigns. And to the extent to which AOC can raise extraordinary amounts of money and spread that money around to like-minded people and make important contributions to Democratic victory, that will certainly increase her power and influence within the Democratic Party. So I think you're correct about that premise.
Dr. Casey, may I request you, please, if possible, you're a little bit away from the mic, maybe, so your sound level is a bit low. If you could kindly, be a bit closer to the mic when you're speaking,
Okay.
sir. Sure. Thank you very much. Now, my question, again, leading into this is that, now, of course, you have the various subcommittees, right? So now, let's say the brand of AOC politics or the agenda or the topics that she is pushing, or this wing of the Democratic Party is pushing, would it not come into conflict with, let's say, the wider segments of the party in various subcommittees, in various issues and topics which are there? Like, I mean, as you mentioned, it's about, I mean, the New Deal or the New Green Deal. uh, which is being envisaged, or on the issue of immigration, or on the issue of minimum wage. Like they're pushing for $15, but that doesn't seem to be happening, or probably could be, but a few years down the line, maybe there'll be more consensus for that, or taxes, even, right? Education, trade unionism, which you mentioned and which you also have good experience, and education sector, right? Affordable housing. Now, in all of these sectors, when the issues come up before the Congress, would there be, how much of a conflict would there be? See, there are two ways to look at it. One, at times you have a conflict which is a creative conflict, right? You have differences, you push the envelope, and then you come to a consensus. But then there could be situations or moments wherein you have a conflict wherein you say, no, this is a line in the sand for me, I'm not moving beyond this. Do you see some such, such, if not stalemates, kind of coming up in the whole range of issues which the Democratic Party has to address going ahead?
So, what I would say is that there's a potential for conflict there, but what I have found is that Ocasio-Cortez is very politically skilled and very savvy about what you need to do if your goal is to actually adopt progressive legislation. And in fact, there are people to her left who are accusing her of selling out in some way. For example, there was a move right after the November election that somehow Ocasio-Cortez and others on the Democratic Party's progressive wing should not agree to re-elect Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House unless she would have a vote on Medicare for All, which is a proposal to basically move the United States to a full single-payer system of healthcare insurance. And Ocasio-Cortez was having none of it. To do that, even if it had been successful, would be quite foolish, because there's no way that Medicare for All was going to have a majority vote in the House of Representatives. So you would be creating a political line around something where you couldn't actually win any tangible results. And so I think she has been, and in this she's exercised some leadership, because I think it's also true of the others in the Congress. She's been very consistent in recognizing two things. One, the need to elect Democrats and to have Democratic majority in Congress and Democratic presidency. I think it's like almost universally agreed that the Democratic left were all in the November election and did everything they possibly could to ensure Biden's election. I mean, part of that is the stakes. No doubt about the fact that the reelection of Trump would have been the consolidation of an authoritarian far-right regime. But it was also, I think, a sort of political sense that some people to her left lack. Some people are saying, there's no difference between Biden and Trump, as remarkable a position as that might be. But she's also, I think, been very clear about, as a congressperson and as her work as a legislator, wanting to enact the most progressive legislation possible, and not taking positions that might have some sort of moral stance, but were not politically achievable. And so, I think, what is interesting about the latest Biden proposals around infrastructure is that they actually include issues of sort of green economy. And so that, some of the sorts of things that Ocasio-Cortez and others had been promoting in the Green Deal, they've had a real influence on, the proposals that the Biden administration is putting forward. And I think she understands that that's the game. That's what she can achieve right now, and so she's prepared to focus on that. So at this moment, I'm not particularly worried about her or the other parts of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party taking sort of litmus test stands on issues, as opposed to there's no reason for them to do so, really, because the evidence of what's possible from their growing influence in the party is right before them. So I think it's in their political interest to continue to try to move more progressive legislation that they know has a reasonable chance of getting through Congress and being signed by the president.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey. As now we are moving towards the final rounds, a couple of more questions. And folks, I know we can see that several folks are watching, and we are getting several likes to this show going on right now, but we have not got any questions. So please feel free to put in a question, or maybe you guys are enjoying the talk so much, and because there's a lot of American political history going into this discussion right now, and we are thankful for Dr. Casey for highlighting and throwing light on such nuances with such clarity. Thank you, Dr. Casey. Now, my question to you is, you see, one of the strategies, of course, which is being adopted, it seems, is by Ocasio-Cortez and the progressive wing, is often about the insider versus the outsider, right? That, okay, you've been there for so long, even within the Democratic Party, you've been holding office for like 10, 20, 30 years or whatever that number. You've not performed, so I'm the outsider now coming in a sense, right, within the party. Would such stance, and of course, like, let's say, stance on topics or issues like, let's say, infrastructure. I mean, the idea that $10 trillion over 10 years, for example, right, as a as a milestone or as a flag out there, right, or the $15 wage and all. So would these kind of positions kind of rub off some or many of the Democrat Party, again, colleagues in the House? And then that brings me to another question. You mentioned Speaker Pelosi. There has been talk and all, etc. also that, okay, would AOC be sometime shooting for the Speaker's or the House majority position, though whenever it may turn out to be. But would that not kind of create opposition within the party for AOC and the progressive wing and for the agenda?
So to start with the last question first, I think that I would not think, I mean, Pelosi has basically said this was her last term as Speaker and that she would step down. I would be very surprised if Ocasio-Cortez offered herself as the next Speaker, because I don't think the progressive wing in the Democratic Party is yet strong enough to elect someone like her. I think what she will do is look pretty much what she did in the current Speaker's situation. When people are telling her you need to oppose Pelosi, she said, I'm going to look and see who's running. Is the person running against her more progressive or not? And in those cases, the people running against Pelosi were actually less progressive than Pelosi. So I think Ocasio-Cortez would look for a candidate for the next Speaker who is progressive or more on the progressive side, and would consolidate behind such a candidate. That's what I would expect. And what was your first question there again?
My first question was, yes, more to do with, like, again, the conflict or, clashing, the insider versus outsider, that whole perspective or that whole positioning. and going in as an, okay, fine, we are here to kind of, disrupt or create a all new Democratic Party, which could rub off with a lot of existing Democrats.
Yeah. So I think American political history is littered with the corpses of attempts to do purely outside politics from the left, trying to create political parties of the left as third parties. There are just various reasons why it is very, very difficult in the current electoral system and political system for a third party to be elected. At the same time, a purely inside strategy ends up being simply transactional on the terrain of the existing politics. And so if, like Ocasio-Cortez, you're interested in something that's more transformational, you need to be able to simultaneously do a sort of inside-outside strategy, where on the one hand, you're working to build progressive forces within the Democratic Party, to build a wing of the Democratic Party that's more pro-labor, more pro-human rights, more anti-racist. And at the same time, you have enough of an inside game that you're actually able to win tangible victories in terms of legislation, in terms of who is in charge of the bureaucracy and what sort of policies they're enacting. And so that kind of walking on two legs strategy can be difficult. Sometimes it's hard for people to maintain their political balance. But if you're really interested at the end of the day in not just articulating some sort of vision, but actually being able to politically enact it, then I think you have to be able to do both.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey. A very interesting roundup that you've given. And folks who are watching, please remember this is a live show, but at the end of it, a YouTube video of this program would also be put up on our YouTube channel, and you can share it with your colleagues or watch it at your own convenience. Now, that said, now we're heading into the concluding round with Dr. Leo Casey, Executive Director of the Albert Shanker Institute. In fact, we have about a minute or so, we would love to let our viewers know a little bit more about the work of the Institute, sir. If you can just give a 30-second, 45-second, overview of the work of the Institute, because I think that does tie in, and that's where your expertise is coming, so that what you've been sharing this past hour with our audiences, I think is rooted a lot in your own personal experience and expertise and of the work that you do at the Institute. So if you can give a 30-second, 45-second overview of the Institute, sir.
Thank you. The Albert Shanker Institute is best understood as a strategic think tank that is affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers, which is a national teachers union here in the United States, one of the two national teacher unions in the United States. We took our name from a late president of the American Federation of Teachers, and our mission is to pursue the three themes that defined his life as a public intellectual. Public education, the important role that public education serves in democracy and as a means of opportunity for people, particularly young people who are born into poverty. The second theme is trade unionism. Again, trade unions play an absolutely vital role in democracy. And again, they play a very important role as a sort of ladder into the middle class for many people. And the last issue is democracy promotion in the United States and around the world. For a long time, we thought that mission was to help democratic forces around the world. But recently, democracy itself in the United States has hung in the balance. And so we've been focusing on democracy at home in recent years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey. Absolutely, yes. In fact, I think maybe sometime we would be doing a program or a discussion deeper into issues of education and teachers and unionism In fact, one interesting phenomena over the past so many years one could see is that trade unions had moved away from the Democratic Party also, right? The quote unquote the working classes. Why? And how much can they be, brought back into the fold, so to say? And of course, democracy. So maybe that would be a topic of some other discussion we would love to have you, because definitely as social issues and democracy itself within America is also under question, challenge, but it's a work in progress, always towards some perfection. Now, that said, this is the last comment I would request from you as your closing remarks. My question would be, sure, you can wrap up in any which manner you would like, but if you could kindly address, what do you think in the next congressional cycle, how much of a gain would the social democrats, democratic socialists, or progressives, or Ocasio-Cortez, you know, uh, momentum, how much of an impact in terms of numbers of seats in the next congressional cycle do you think coming up? Do you think there'll be a significant uptick, or yeah, something like that?
So this is an interesting question because traditionally, in an off-year election, in the United States, presidential elections are every 4 years. Then congressional elections are every 2 years. Traditionally, in this first, off-year election, the party that is in control in Congress and the presidency tends to lose seats. I think there's good reasons to think that will not happen. I think that the presence of Trump on the ballot is a sort of confounding factor, which changes a lot of the calculations. It will be very hard for the Republicans to pull out the same intensity of vote that he was able to pull out as president. And so I think that 22 may actually look more like 18, where Democrats fought the election around issues like healthcare and the economy and made significant gains. So that's one question. I don't know that they will be massive gains, but if the election was held today, Democrats would have very significant pickups, given the popularity of the Biden administration and the initiatives that they're proposing. The one issue here, a very serious issue, and I expect to see a political battle over this, is that Republicans across the country now are trying to enact laws that are voter suppression laws that would make it more difficult for people to vote, particularly sort of traditional Democratic constituencies like African Americans, Latinos, poor people. And so there will be a battle, fought over whether or not they're successful in doing that, and whether or not legislation comes out of Washington, D.C., which would reinforce the very important piece of legislation before Congress that would reinforce voting rights and make voting more accessible. So that's a little bit of an unknown factor at this point. It's not clear what effect that would have. I do expect that there will be more pickups within the Democratic caucus for the progressives, seats where a more moderate or conservative Democrat will be replaced by a more progressive one, either when somebody retires, or there will be some competitive primaries where some people may be defeated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leo Casey. It's been a pleasure to have you on the panel with us. And I'm sure our viewers would have gained some very interesting insights from you in terms of American political history, and especially with regards to Ocasio-Cortez and her, her brand or her style of politics and the issues. And not only her, I mean, she represents, some vectors or forces or thoughts within the country, which she is leading, or maybe at the same time also, grooming to take forward towards uh, participatory politics and to influence legislation and leadership in the United States of America. Thank you so much, Dr. Leo Casey of the Albert Shanker Institute, for joining us on the Saturday noon hour on this topic of the day today. Once again, folks, this was a discussion regarding American politics, domestic politics, and where it's heading now. We are now reaching the end of this broadcast. Our next session or next episode or next show would be coming up, and please do join in then. That will be on the 1st of May, which would be touching upon the topic of hatred or violence or race crimes, it seems, are on the rise in the United States, unfortunately, with respect to Asian Americans. So, is this a pandemic? Is there a, I mean, what is happening and how and where are race relations within the United States headed? That would be the topic for our next Saturday noon hour on the 1st of May. Till then, thank you so much. Please view this video on YouTube. We'll be putting up a link on our YouTube channel so that you can visit and listen into this show which was there today and which is ending now. That being said, thank you everyone. Have a good day. This show ends now.